Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going over a severe weather risk across a pretty large portion of the country that begins today and goes into tomorrow. Today's risk will feature storms from Oklahoma through Missouri and maybe into Illinois and Indiana. So there could be some supercells initially, but I do think that this event will end with a more linear mode. So we'll take a look at a few soundings. First of all, we'll take a look at kind of this area, central Oklahoma. And then we'll take a look at around the St. Louis area. Here's the one from Oklahoma, and it shows a pretty decent environment for tornadoes. Plenty of instability, steep lapse rates, and adequate dew point spreads. Photographs also look decent. Not a lot of shear from 0 to 1 kilometers, but from 0 to 3 kilometers, there certainly is plenty of shear for tornadoes. Here's around St. Louis, and this is going to be before a squall line moves through the area. At least that's what's being forecast right now. Instability looks fairly adequate for tornadoes, but there is a little bit more wind shear, especially from 0 to 1 kilometer, about twice the 0 to 1 kilometer shear as there was on the Oklahoma sounding. So here's the tornado outlook I put out for today. So I have a pretty large 5% tornado risk from Oklahoma through Missouri into Illinois and a little bit of southeastern Kansas. But I did decide to add a small 10% risk area around St. Louis or so. And that's simply because I think the squall line will be moving through right about the time that we get a little bit of a low-level shear increase, which would favor tornadoes, assuming that the squall line is orientated correctly, and a few other things. This event is also going to be aided tornado-wise by the potential for multiple rounds of storms, which is why, or at least part of the reason, I decided to add a 10% risk in that area. But then the threat will shift further east into parts of the Ohio River Valley and maybe the southern U.S. So this is what the radar could look like tomorrow at around 3 p.m. We can see the potential for discrete supercells working their way through Indiana and eventually into Ohio. If this ends up happening, there will certainly be a tornado risk, and I'll talk about why in a second when we look at the soundings. However, I do think that it's very possible that this ends up being a more linear mode than expected, which would lower the strong tornado risk and maybe the overall tornado risk in general, especially a little bit further south in these states. Then there's also going to be some storms that are a little bit further south from Mississippi, northern Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And it shows a lot more of a messy storm mode. However, I do think that a discrete storm mode is still certainly possible. A little bit further south, being in a little bit more of the right exit region of the trough, you can often get more subtle forcing, and in turn a more discrete storm mode. Our first sounding we're going to look at is from Indiana, and it does show a pretty good environment for tornadoes. Adequate moisture, adequate instability, And then the photographs definitely look favorable for tornadoes. 30 knots of 0 to 1 kilometer shear, and then over 50 knots of 0 to 3 kilometer shear. Both of those numbers are rather impressive, and I do think being near the surface low could actually help the storm out a little bit more in terms of tornado potential. Curvature in the photograph, though, is a little bit on the marginal side, but it could very much be enough for tornadic storms, especially being near the surface low. Here's a little bit further south in, I think this was like northern Kentucky, maybe it was northern Tennessee, maybe southern Kentucky. And it shows a pretty similar environment as the one further north. Instability looks still adequate, and photographs also look fairly similar. So, not much change from there to there, but I do think that there will also be an enhanced area of tornado risk in Virginia. Models have been showing fairly consistently an area of enhanced tornado potential in Virginia, and it certainly shows, according to this model, adequate instability and moisture. Not quite as impressive with the photographs, but still certainly enough for some tornadoes. So with all this into consideration, here's my tornado outlook for tomorrow. I did decide to add 2 different areas of enhanced tornado probabilities. One of them, Indiana and Ohio, where I think curvature is a little bit on the marginal side, but it could be helped out by the surface low. And then a little bit further south, in particularly Tennessee and Kentucky, where soundings certainly look favorable as well. And then here's that Virginia tornado risk as well. So we could be talking about a trimodal severe weather outbreak tomorrow. And there is some potential for a tornado outbreak either today or tomorrow. Right now, tomorrow looks the most impressive to me, though, especially if we can get a discrete storm mode, which certainly seems possible in one of these areas. So, with that said, thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Goodbye.